Okay, so now that we have kind of a general idea about what a species is, at least some of the concepts that people use, we're going to talk about some of the forces that impact populations as they become species. Now, because gene flow is such an important concept for sexually reproducing species, one of the key ways that we get speciation, that is, we get a single population that eventually is divided into two, and those two populations then become different enough to be called species, is geography. So geography is really important when it comes to sexually reproducing species, because if you're geographically separated from one another, then inevitably, given enough time, you're going to become different species. So two populations that can't share new mutations, they can't be spread from one population to the next. Things that are fixed by genetic drift, those things are different, going to be in one population than the other because that's somewhat random. So eventually two populations without some amount of gene flow are going to become new species. Now, usually that is quite a slow process. And so speciation, I like to say, is a little bit like growing up, meaning that it's really hard to define when someone becomes an adult, right? So you might say, hey, is it your quinceañera? Is it when you get your driver's license? Is it when you graduate from high school? It's a process, right? And so at the extremes, if I put a 5-year-old boy next to a 35-year-old man, it's going to be really easy to tell who's the adult and who is the child. If, on the other hand, I put a 15-year-old boy and a 16-year-old boy next to each other, it might be really difficult to tell which one's the adult and which one's the child. In fact, the answer might be, well, they both are kind of half and half. And so speciation is the same thing. It's usually quite a slow, long, drawn-out process. So if I separate two populations, we're not going to say, oh, look, they're new species, right? They'd just be the same species but in different areas. If I came back after 100 years, I would see some differences. Probably not enough to call them new species. 1,000, 10,000. Now we're going to start to see differences that might define them as separate species. However, where that speciation division occurred is really impossible to draw a single straight line, because in most times it is a very slow process. So there are three main modes of speciation. In this first one, we're going to give you a subcategory. Allopatric means different homeland or different geography. So allopatric occurs when we have two separate species. Now your book calls this the dumbbell model. We're just going to call this plain old allopatric speciation. And they've drawn it as if one species changed, color-coded here in green, and the other one stayed the same, but very likely both of them would have changed enough that then they would become separate species. Now the subcategory of this that you need to know, and it will come back later in a later lecture, is peripheral. So peripheral speciation is a type of allopatric speciation, and it occurs when a small subpopulation is separated from the main population. Now this is critical because the main population is going to have different forces because of its size and because it's probably still in the same place it had been evolving for maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of years. Whereas this new population, maybe on an island, maybe being broken off in a new area, that is likely to be small, so it's going to have increased force of genetic drift, and if it's in a new area, it's going to have different natural selection forces. So typically what will happen with peripheral speciation is the large population will remain relatively unchanged, but the small population will change rapidly and maybe become quite different from the founding population after just a short period of time. Okay, so now even if these two areas had identical environments, and in the real world it's never 100% identical, but let's say we have tropical island number 1, tropical island number 2, same size, basically the same, they would still become different from one another. We would still get speciation. It just might take longer, right? Because even with identical environments, assuming that's possible, where we have the same force of natural selection, we would have different random mutations occurring. We would have different fixation of alleles. The alleles that became fixed in population A versus population B would be different because it's random chance. And so peripheral speciation, again, is different because the subpopulation changes rapidly. So there's some really cool examples of allopatric speciation. I'm just going to look at one. About 5 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama formed, separating the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean on this side. And until then, we had populations that were spread across this entire Caribbean basin. But when it became separated, the ones on the eastern side became completely separated from the ones on the western side. And so today we can see all sorts of species groups where there's a Pacific one that is most closely related to a Caribbean species. So that was a allopatric speciation event. Now, just a quick word, the barrier that creates complete geographic separation is going to be different depending on the species we're talking about. For some species that can't get across water or can't climb up over mountains, we might have a fairly low barrier that creates 100% separation between two populations. But if we're a bird that migrates or travels easily, then maybe there's really no such thing as a geographic barrier. Some birds, like Arctic terns, migrate back and forth across the entire world. So this barrier, the Isthmus of Panama, is more than enough to create a barrier for, say, shrimp, or crayfish, saltwater animals that can't crawl long distances on land and can't get in fresh water. But for bird species, it's probably going to be not much of a barrier at all. They'll just migrate back and forth and still have one big population spread over that area. Here's an example of peripheral speciation. In this one, we talked a little bit already about this, where we were looking for different genetic signs. But here's peripheral speciation occurring as new habitat is moved into by founding populations. And so these founding populations have the potential to be very, very different from the population from which they were derived. Okay, so that's when islands are a really great natural laboratory and often serve as really good examples of peripheral speciation too. So one fruit fly population made it to Hawaii millions of years ago, and since then it has diversified, speciated. We have hundreds of different ones as they've moved across all the different islands, all from that one founding ancestral population. Okay, the second type of speciation when we're talking about geography is parapatric. So just like parallel lines, parapatric means two areas that are right next to each other. And in parapatric speciation, we never have a complete separation. However, what ends up happening is you end up with a gradient. This might be due to selection, so maybe individuals on this side are in a dry area, individuals on this side are in a wet area. And so we have different selection pressures that cause allelic differences across the entire population. And if this goes on long enough, and if there's limited migration moving that variability back and forth, eventually we can get a very, very distinct separation between those, and that's called a hybrid zone. So a hybrid zone is where we get a few hybrids, maybe they interbreed a little bit, but usually hybrids don't do as well. And so there's a fairly clear separation between what's on the western side and what's on the eastern side in this example. Or it could be north-south. Okay? And so in Parapatric, there needs to be some other barrier other than simple geography, because there's no clear geographic barrier. So it might be different habitat. Maybe the ones up here are living high on a mountain and the ones down here are living lower on a mountain, and they flower at different times. So there's not much potential for them to hybridize. So there are many different things, but no clear geographic barrier. So parapatric speciation can occur, and there's some good instances of it, but it's probably less common than allopatric speciation. So this hybrid zone is kind of interesting, and there are lots of studies looking at this reproductive isolating mechanism. In some birds, which show a clear eastern United States versus western United States distribution, they may have different songs. And so although they will hybridize sometimes, they don't do it readily because the females from one species don't recognize and don't like the song from the other species. And then we can get these kind of complicated mixes of parapatric and allopatric speciation called a ring species. On worksheet 4, you'll have an example of this and look at this, so we'll explain it now. In ring species, populations that are next to each other, maybe even not right next to each other, but relatively close, can exchange genes. And so there's gene flow, and they stay relatively similar. But gene flow from one to the next to the next to the next is so uncommon and takes so many years that species 2 or subspecies 2 in this example might be very, very different from species 8, and we may not even, if we moved an individual from 8 to species 2, they may have a really hard time mating or finding a mate. And by the time we get all the way to the other side of the ring, then they may be completely incompatible. And so although potentially alleles from population 8 could get into population 9 over here, it might take many tens of thousands of years with moving into this population and this one and this one. So the amount that actually gets mixed between those populations is incredibly low. And again, the barrier that constitutes a central barrier in a ring species is going to vary. For some terrestrial species that don't move back and forth a lot, a lake might be a very good one. The polar ice cap is actually a good example of a central barrier to organisms that are found all around, like up in the taiga, the pine forest in the north of Canada and Alaska, but they can't climb up over the ice cap and go to Siberia or like Norway or Sweden. And so there might be similarities in interbreeding between close populations, but they can't move up and across. So this creates some really interesting, complicated patterns in these ring species. So this one is an example where the Central Valley in California, which is warmer and drier, is a barrier to these salamanders that have to live up in the foothills, the cool, wet foothills of the coastal range, and then in the Sierra Nevadas here. And so we have well-defined, recognizable subspecies that can mate often with ones that are next to them, but E. platensis here would be completely incompatible with E. schultzii. Is that a great name? E. schultzii. Anyway, good example of a ring species. So just know that one example. You'll be asked for one. You can use this one as on an example on the worksheet, or you could look up and find another one. Now, the third and final type of geographic barrier that we're going to be interested in when we're talking about speciation is sympatric speciation. And sim means same or identical. So in sympatric speciation, there is no clear separation between the diverging parts of the population. They may be completely mixed together. So geographically, at least, maybe ecologically there is. So for instance, some of these might be diurnal, meaning active during the day, and others might tend to be more nocturnal. And so mating is rare because they're up and about different times of the day. And if that's enough separation to make those two populations become more and more different, eventually they could become two distinct species despite never having any distinct geographic separation. And so the cause of reproductive isolation could be many different things. Diurnal versus nocturnal might be one. Here's an example where they are utilizing different parts of the lake. And so this might be stretching sympatric speciation, but these are typically thought of as the most famous examples. When a lake forms due to subsidence, so normally it was just a river flowing over an area, the land gets lower and lower and lower, eventually fills up and becomes a lake. When that occurs, the river fish get in and then have all these new niches that were not previously available to them. So they may live in the deep water, or they might live in beds of seaweed or something like that. They may have different food that they can specialize in. And so although they're never completely geographic separated, they're all in the same lake, they may be spending more of their time in one part of the lake versus another. And so this competition for different resources might be a barrier that is strong enough and long enough to completely separate them into new species. One of my favorites is this genus of flies called Ragalides, which has two species. One, probably the ancient ancestral one was very much like this, specializes on wild crabapple trees, and they lay their eggs in the fruit, and so they only mate when they have available fruit. So they all find a tree, they mate, and they lay eggs right there. There's another species that has adapted and is now in the domesticated apples. And so these two have become separate species, maybe just over the last couple thousand years as humans have domesticated apples. And they've done this by partitioning out the different resources and specializing, and that separates their mating out also, but specializing on these different resources. Okay, so those three: sympatric with its kind of variation in not really being separated; parapatric, where we have some distinction from one side to the other, but no clear separation in a cline and maybe even a hybrid zone in the middle; and then allopatric, which is a complete geographic physical separation. And remember that peripheral speciation is a subcategory of allopatric speciation. And also one other thing, in peripheral speciation, the process to separate the two populations and make them distinct, clear species is usually a little bit faster than in just regular old allopatric, parapatric speciation, because we have a rapid change in this small population. So although still not really, really fast, peripheral speciation tends on average to be a little bit faster than just those other standard types of speciation that we talked about.